Hi, my name is Ben Solomon. This is my presentation about the Aboriginal Australians. Brief history about Australia. It is 7.692 million kilometers squared. It is the largest oceanic country, one of the largest countries in the world by landmass. It is also the only country to cover an entire continent. Australia has a unique landscape from its famous outbacks with the largest with the with some of the largest deserts in the country, where temperatures are scorching hot with little to no water or vegetation, to its dense rainforest in the northeast part of the country that contains all kinds of vegetation. It is home to nearly 24 million people. Of the 24 million people, 745,000 or 3% of the total Indigenous population remain today. New South Wales has the largest population of Aboriginals people with 265,700 people. Queensland has the second largest population with 221,400 people, and the smallest population of Aboriginal Australians live in the Australian Capital Territory, which is marked with the A on the map here. So, who are the Aboriginal Australians? Well, they are the first people of Australia and the oldest Indigenous group in the world. They have lived on the continent for 50,000 plus years. They have 250 distinct language groups spread all throughout Australia, with some languages running into danger. There are two groups of Aboriginal Australians. There are the Aboriginal people and the Torres Strait Islander people. The Aboriginal people, these are the people that lived on Australia before Britain began colonizing the island in 1788. Their flag was designed in 1970s. The colors of the Aboriginal people represent the aspects of Aboriginal life. The black symbolizes the Aboriginal people, the yellow represents the sun, the red represents the earth and the relationship between the people and the land. Going over to the Torres Strait Islander people, they had come from the Torres Strait Islands, which is a part of modern day Queen's Island, Australia. Their flag was designed in the 1990s. It features a white dairy, which is a type of headdress, with 5-pointed star that represents the different island groups. This is a map showing where the Torres Strait Islands are. The white on the flag represents peace. The green represents the land. Black represents the people, and the blue represents the sea. Origination. Aboriginal Australians have been around the continent for 50,000 plus years, with some scientists saying that they have been here earlier, as in 65 to 80,000 years ago. It is thought that these people have traveled across a land bridge that connected northern Australia and Asia. DNA has allowed for better understanding of where and when and how the Aboriginal Australians got to Australia. 5 key elements of the Indigenous culture. The first key element of Indigenous culture is the land. It is important to Indigenous culture because it sustains and has sustained people and their culture. The second point is family. The third point is law. Law is a key point because Indigenous people do not want to go through assimilation and unfair treatments again. Ceremonies. Ceremonies allow for Aboriginals to express their culture and traditions through art, music, singing, and dancing. Language is important because it is what makes Australian Aboriginals so diverse with all their different language groups. Settlers of Australia. Dutch explorers had landed on Australia in 1608. By 17 1888, British settlers began colonizing Australia. Many of these settlers were criminals and were sent to Australia as a punishment. The British settlers had lived with their Aboriginal Australians, but not long after began fighting with them because British settlers were trying to seize the land while Indigenous people were trying to fight them off. This clash has caused 20,000 Indigenous people to die. In 1851, gold had started to be discovered, which led to a rush of thousands of immigrants flooding the country in search of gold. In 1856, 6 colonies, New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, Western Australia, South Australia, and Queensland, were formed. In 1901, these 6 colonies were known as the Commonwealth. From 1910 to 1970s, the Australian government took 10 to 33% of the Aboriginal children from their homes, known as the Stolen Children's Generation. Just like First Nations being taken away from their families to be in residential schools, the Australian kids were taken from their families and were put into adoptive families and institutions. They were not allowed to speak their language. Their names were often changed. And those who made it through the institution and their adopted families, they suffer from trauma and suffer from unfair treatment. The Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, in 2008 apologized to Aboriginal Australians for the country's actions. In 1967, Aboriginal Australians voted that federal laws needed to apply to them. They didn't have the right to vote nor a full citizenship until 1965. Struggles Aboriginal Australians face today. 3% of Australia's population has Aboriginal history. It is a struggle to keep their ancient culture. They have to fight for recognition and restitution from the government. The Australian state Victoria is working towards the first kind of treaty with its Indigenous people. They want to recognize sovereignty and include compensation. However, Australia itself has never made a treaty, making it the only British Commonwealth to not have a treaty with their Indigenous people. The social rights of the original people. People now need to understand the rights of Aboriginal Australians. They have the right to a distinct status and culture. This maintains and strengthens the identity, spiritual, and cultural practices of Indigenous communities. They also have the right to self-determination, a process where Indigenous communities take control of their future and decide how they will address the issues facing them. And lastly, they have the right to the land. This provides the spiritual and culture basis of Indigenous communities. This concludes my presentation on the Aboriginal Australians. I hope you have learned a little about Australia, who the Aboriginal Australians are, and where they have originated from, along with some key concepts of Indigenous culture, who the settlers of Australia are, and why they were there, and what struggles they had caused for the Indigenous people of Australia. And lastly, the rights of Indigenous Australians hold as the original people of the land that we should all know. Thank you for listening.